Thanks everyone for being with us today. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm Tanya Harry, I'm Gisha's Executive Director. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first panel of our two-part Gaza Policy Forum. So at the end of 2018, we gathered about 100 Palestinian, Israeli, and foreign stakeholders in Jerusalem in person to discuss the situation in Gaza and make policy recommendations to all the actors with influence over Palestinian lives in the Strip. The upside to us not being able to meet in person is that residents of Gaza and the West Bank actually don't need a permit this time to attend the forum. And we're grateful to host this gathering even in these unfortunate circumstances. But like in 2018, we will be compiling and publishing the policy recommendations made today by both our panelists and our guests. Our goal really is to both take stock of where we're at, but also define what must be done to enhance the protection of rights and well-being in the Strip. The recommendations will be published, but without attribution to any specific speaker. Today's panel is going to explore the isolation of Gaza in the context of Israel's annexationist vision for the West Bank. And I'm really pleased to welcome three expert women panelists. Al-Masri is the research assistant for Gaza at Human Rights Watch and a native of Gaza City. She's worked as an interpreter for journalists and in foreign and local NGOs in the Strip. Dr. Yael Berda is an Israeli lawyer, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Hebrew University, and currently a visiting lecturer in sociology at Harvard University. Her research explores the intersections of law, race, bureaucracy, and the state. Dr. Natalie טוצ'י is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and an honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. She is currently special advisor to the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy and also advised his predecessor. So the webinar is going to begin with a moderated discussion with our panelists, which will be recorded and it'll be publicized after the event. We're not live right now. We will then open the floor up for an off-the-record conversation, which will not be recorded or publicized. So please bear with us through this kind of experimentation. We would like to have participation from our audience as much as we can in these weird times. This is a webinar, so the video function is going to be disabled for all attendees. So nothing is wrong, don't worry. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions at any time for the panelists. And you'll also be able to ask a question via audio in the Q&A section of the event by raising your hand. If you have any tech also speak for a panel moderated by me about the humanitarian and economic situation, particularly in light of recent developments. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Beth Oppenheim, Gisha's Director of International Relations. She's going to be moderating today's panel, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. So until the end of August, Gaza had been shielded from the spread of the coronavirus, which is largely because of these very stringent restrictions on movement. But very concerningly, as of the last few weeks, we now have 1,024 cases diagnosed inside the community in Gaza. And obviously that could be absolutely catastrophic because of Gaza's very dense population and of course because of the infrastructure that's already been decimated by many years of closure policy by Israel and also conflict with Israel, and of course made worse by the internal Palestinian political split. Now, one of the main takeaways of the last Gaza Policy Forum was that the Strip's so-called humanitarian crisis is actually man-made. And so short-term easing measures like increasing aid or even larger scale development projects can only ever be a sticking plaster because they don't address the fundamental issues, underlying issues, which are of course political. So we're very lucky to have three panelists today who work across civil society, academia, and diplomacy, and some of them in all three. And we want to have a discussion relying on their insight about ways forward out of the deadlock that the region and that specifically Gaza find themselves in. And we want to really examine the motivations of the different actors involved and the political dynamics at play that are feeding into these cycles. And as Tanya mentioned, next week at the same time, we're going to dive in deeper into the economic and humanitarian situation. But today we're really trying to broaden out and look at the kind of political perspective also. So as many of you will be aware, of course, Israel maintains very comprehensive control over the Gaza Strip, despite this myth of disengagement when Israel pulled its settlers and its army out in 2005. And that engenders a really strong obligation on Israel's part to protect basic rights and living conditions in Gaza, and that's, you know, grounded in international law. But time and again, we see Israel denying that responsibility and doing exactly the opposite. During a global pandemic by implementing a number of restrictive measures. So once more, Gaza's residents were left in the dark, without reliable electricity, without access to essential goods, and without the ability to move freely. And we've now seen that things have returned to the status quo. But of course, Gaza's status quo still means extremely stringent movement restrictions, an economy that's suffering, very weak infrastructure, and this continued isolation of Gaza. So Israel is very deliberately cutting off Gaza from the West Bank by keeping 2 million Palestinians out of Israel's demographic equation. And so while the fanfare about formal annexation may have subsided, Israel very much continues to strengthen its grip over the West Bank by expanding the settlements and, of course, continuing with its movement policy of preventing Gaza residents from traveling or definitely moving to the West Bank. And that's something Gisha has researched in depth and you can read about in our recent paper. So Palestinians, of course, are divided both geographically and also politically. And that has very profound implications for the delivery of services on the ground. And it also prevents a unified Palestinian vision for the future from emerging. Meanwhile, the international community has looked on, you know, fatigued by years of dead-end diplomacy, and of course now very preoccupied with the global health crisis. And we see that many international actors, really what drives their policy is interest, national interest often, or supranational interest, not only with this conflict, but many others. And so for many actors, their economic and defense ties with Israel trump the need to protect international law and human rights. And we saw this very clearly emerge this spring. It was a real litmus test, which was when Israel threatened to formally annex parts of the West Bank. The international community found itself in a bind, unwilling on the one hand to sacrifice the bilateral relationship with Israel, but also not quite ready to cast off international law entirely. So the question is, where will this leave Gaza? So I'm delighted to be able to welcome our panel who have real depth of expertise on these issues. And I'm going to be asking each of the speakers to address a few questions, and then we're going to have a moderated question and answer discussion starting around 5. So I'm going to turn first to Abir. Abir, travel to and from Gaza is at a virtual standstill because of the coronavirus restrictions and, you know, made worse by the suspension of PA coordination. I just wonder if you could outline for us what conditions are like inside Gaza at the moment, and even before the pandemic, what is life like in Gaza under so-called normal circumstances?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you so much for having me. Actually, as you just mentioned, Israel imposed severe restriction of freedom of movement and the freedom of movement of people and goods into and out of Gaza. So it is a general travel ban. It is a general travel ban that which Israel actually excludes. It says like for just exceptional humanitarian cases, the way that Israel actually. And so you can imagine that situation is already tough even for the pandemic. It is already difficult situation even before the suspension of the security coordination. And also even it is when Israel actually, as you may know, last month Israel imposed some punitive measures on Gaza as balloons, flaming balloons and stuff like that on Gaza as punitive measures. So it is one of these restrictions were blocking entry to fuel. It is already dark in Gaza. You know, it's a very critical.
Abir, could I just suggest you turn off your video? I think it will make your audio quality better. Just use the audio and turn off video. Great.
Is it better now?
Yeah, please continue. Thanks, Abir.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it is already a difficult situation, and even when Israel actually last month when they imposed the punitive measures on Gaza, including blocking entry to fuel, just like making the situation getting worse. And it is already a tough situation, even with 8 hours of electricity. This is not the normal reality that we want here in Gaza. It is just what the reality that we have, and we have to accept it because we don't have other choice. As I said, it is a critical situation here with the situation of the pandemic. So actually, since COVID-19 is a global issue, I think maybe the world can imagine if they have to experience about 3 or 6 hours a day during their lockdown. Actually, several months ago, I got stuck in Amman. It was during the beginning of the crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis. It was really tough experience for everyone, for me and for everyone. However, I had access to 20 hours of electricity. I had access to water. In Jordan, there is a good health system for COVID-19 cases. And also the most important thing, there is no constant fear about imminent escalation there. There are no Israeli drones hovering actually above our heads just to remind us there will be escalation soon and there will be death soon and killing. So the situation actually is tough, and it's getting worse, and it is psychologically and physically harming people. For the security coordination, a lot of patients actually, it is impacting people. You can imagine that it is now put lives on hold. So a lot of patients actually, they fear for their lives. They have concern about the possibility to get an exit permit to travel in order to get the treatment. However, it's not actually that easy, even before the suspension of the security coordination. It is always tough. But what is the difference? The difference that it is before the suspension, there was a chance that there is a chance for people that they can struggle, and this struggle might take months or maybe a year. A couple of months ago, I interviewed a father who he told me about his son who has cancer. He was describing me the complicated process. He described it like their struggle is just like it's just a game. You may win or you may lose with your life. So it's just like ongoing. It is ongoing struggle, but now it is getting worse with the pandemic. And now patients have concern about not only patients people, but also as part of my work on people with disabilities. There are also some cases that they are waiting to get back. They are hoping that they will be able to submit a permit so they can go to the West Bank or Jerusalem in order to get, for example, artificial limb, because it is difficult it is always difficult to have an expert here to do it properly for them.
So how do people perceive the PA decision? Is there kind of support behind the idea of resisting annexation, or is there, you know, a lot of criticism towards this approach because, as you said, of the human cost to this decision?
Actually, they see it as, they don't see it that it will be a permanent decision. They see it as a way to pressure Israel regarding the decision on annexation. So most people are just like waiting that this, they imagine that this will be for a short time and it will be ended soon.
I also just wanted to ask you a bit about how you experience the separation policy in your own life and also in your work for Human Rights Watch, because of course that greatly impacts the ability to travel between Gaza and the West Bank. I'm talking now in normal non-coronavirus times. So how does the separation policy actually impinge on your own life and your work for Human Rights Watch?
Yeah, so as you may know, I work with my team, with Israel-Palestine team, but because of that policy, we are separated. I was able to meet them in person after working with them after 2 years working with HRW a couple of years ago. So the closure actually is impacting our work. For example, our team is not able to come to Gaza, so we can work together in the field. We can develop the relationship with our local partners, with the government, and also to be with them, to do also the research in the West Bank with my colleagues. There were times actually in Gaza, I really needed to have a company, to have my teams with me, particularly during the last escalation. The idea that I have my team with me, or I have someone with me, it is comforting. Of course, I'm having actually the support remotely from them, but it is always better to see them in person, especially after being able to meet them. 2 years ago, I was able to go to Jerusalem for the first time, and I just realized how life is just like so easy. I was able to meet them and also work with one of my colleagues, and we did some field work in Ramallah, and that was really great feeling. And also, it took more than 3 decades to make the 1-hour trip to Jerusalem. And I didn't realize that it's that easy, because I made it to the air crossing and my team were waiting for me on the other side. And one other thing, actually, earlier this year, I managed to go to Ramallah, and I just realized how life is so nice without occupation and closure. I managed to get a permit, and I go straight from Gaza to the West Bank, and did actually an interview there. This is my first and unique experience.
Thank you. And 70% of Gaza's population is under 30, and I'm interested to know, how do young people in Gaza view the situation in the Strip and view their own prospects?
Yeah. I imagine if the desperation in each corner in Gaza, and like in the taxi, the groceries, and also in the facility where people are standing in very long lines, where they are trying to submit a permit in order to travel through Rafah crossing. After 13 years, people, including young people, they find themselves packed into unemployment rate with 80%. 80% people rely on humanitarian aid. and also with no sign that this situation will be changed. It is really tough situation for them. Here in Gaza, there are many people that I know in person that they are very wonderful, but they don't actually have the chance that to know and travel for scholarship, and they keep trying. And also artists who need to participate in a certain gallery. The closure actually impacting their psychological situation and condition. Some of them actually they are trying to for example, to have like online business or online employment or something like that. But they are hoping that one day that they can travel freely, that they can see other people, they can see other cultures, that they can talk to people outside Gaza, that we are normal people, so the other people can know about us. They can, we can like, also they can know about other cultures, because there is nothing like freedom of movement. From my own experience, I just remember a couple of years ago, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it was my first time to leave Gaza. And I remember I made it to Amman. It was really amazing feeling to feel that I'm in a big street and I can get a taxi and go to a very long distances without any sign that can stop me to tell me that it is border and you have to stop here. There is nothing like freedom of movement. There is nothing like being free and being the one to decide when or when or where to go.
Thank you so much, Abir. That was really, really powerful. I really appreciate hearing from you. I'm going to move now to Yael, if you're there. So your work explores the ways in which the mundanity of bureaucracy and the permit regime shapes political outcomes. And you've explored this in detail in your book, Living Emergency, which is about the West Bank. But you've also written and spoken about how that same logic applies in Gaza. So I'm interested to know exactly how does the permit regime service the goals of the Israeli government?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much, Abir, for sharing your experience. I think that those last 2 minutes where you described being able to take the taxi, they're so important for understanding how, what does it mean not to have freedom of movement and how it impacts your life. And I just want to start by saying that, 2020 maybe is the year where Palestinian experience goes global. And for the first time, people get a glimpse, a very, very different glimpse, right? It comes from a whole different thing about what is closure, what is lockdown, what is when you have no control over your own movement in your life. And I think all over the world, people asking them, shocked by the fact that they couldn't make a choice to see their family. They couldn't make a choice to go out of their houses. They couldn't make a choice to go to work. They had to find solutions for things that they never imagined they would need to, and all because of mobility restrictions. And so I think in some way, it might be possible to better, to capture the attention of ears and eyes that have been closed to the plight of Gazans who are under siege for so many years, without those basic freedoms of making that choice of being able to move. Now, so my work on the West Bank, I think the West Bank and Gaza are very different but it is part of what I call a repertoire of legal spatial measures that their purpose is to control population through separation, surveillance, and monitoring. Now, what happens is that the justification for these measures is always security. The reason for these measures is always going to be security. And then And then there's that the conversation stops being about why these measures are taking place, and it starts being about the technicalities. And so I want to move for 1 second from the Israeli government apparatus. I call it the bureaucracy of the occupation. It is not just the civil administration and the coordination of government actions in the territories. The bureaucracy of the occupation includes the ministries of defense, the ministries of economy, the employment organizations, and also Israeli corporations and economic organizations that all take part in the regulation of movement of Palestinians for political and economic reasons. So it is not just, you know, talking to DCOs or talking to COGAT. I think thinking of it as a field where you have many different agents and many different organizations with different interests is helpful for understanding how it works and why it's so contradictory at times. It's very hard to understand. I mean, it's not hard for people on the ground, right? Like Abir says, people stand wait in lines for years to be able to get a permit. So at the end, you know, the end user of the bureaucracy, the situation is quite clear. But anyone trying to understand what the purpose or goal of the structure is can become very, very confused, if not very cynical. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens when everything is geared toward the security, and in order to have the conversation with the Israeli bodies, one must accept that premise of security and never challenge it, right? I mean, probably anyone who's been in human rights organizations or diplomats knows this. You can get through to people if you're going to be talking about economic policies, if you're going to be talking about humanitarian issues, but you have to stay out of the political structure and the questioning of security measures as methods of separation, control, and atomization, because I think atomization is a very, very strong part of what the outcome of the permanent regime. Atomization meaning keeping people separate. What Abil was describing and not being able to work with her colleagues is what happens with atomization is that people cannot organize. They cannot organize social structures. They cannot organize political structures. They cannot make plans to make changes that are necessary to build your city, to build your community, to build your life. And that atomization, if anyone asks me what the goal of the permanent regime is to atomize Palestinian society to the point that it cannot create that social and political coagulation to form its governing bodies and its economic bodies and cultural bodies. And actually, that's a goal that has not worked. And I know that people, it's hard to look on the bright side, but even with coronavirus and the very impressive response of Palestinian Authority and civil society in the West Bank, and impressive response, I think, in Gaza as well. You actually see how it's actually quite incredible how under these conditions of perpetual atomization and separation and segregation, people are actually managing to make things work. And that, that kind of says to you, look at this. I mean, literally there is the most sophisticated population management system on the planet that has been ongoing for decades, and a siege that has been going on fully for a decade. And yet there are these possibilities for social and political organizations. And so I think in that way, and I'm just going to jump to recommendations, stop me if you want to talk about something else. But I think that one of the things that people can do, both pro-democracy Israelis and human rights organizations and the international community can do, is stop agreeing to have the technical conversation about economics or about humanitarian aid, or about health policy, or about quotas, and have the conversation that needs to be had about political solutions that take into account that, yes, Israel is fully responsible for the lives of 2 million people in Gaza, that Gaza is not on the moon, it is not separate from the West Bank. There is no possible solution for the situation in Israel-Palestine as a whole without Gaza. Yes, the disengagement was basically possibly one of the worst decisions that Israeli government and society ever made. And I think that there's a realization of that also within Israeli society, but that's not the point right now. I do think that one thing that will enable change is to view Gaza, first center it and view it as not separate, not only not separate from the West Bank, but also not separate from Israel. I mean, we have this one system, it's a condition. There's one government that controls the entire territory. We have to see it for what it is, regardless of what kind of solution one wants to see, right? Regardless of the solution that you want to see, we need to be able to look at the situation, see it for what it is, and also see that today, Israel governs through a code in which political status is linked to mobility, right? We think that political status and citizenship is linked to rights. In the Israeli case, it's not. I just want to say a little bit about this. I think it might be useful to understand. So in a situation where there's closure and a permit system that is privileging mobility, you have people that have subjects that have no mobility and no citizenship. These are the Gazans. You have West Bankers that have some mobility and do not have citizenship, and they don't have the possibility for political participation in the government that rules their lives. You have residents of East Jerusalem who have some sort of political status, they're residents and not citizens, and some sort of mobility. And then you have Palestinian citizens of Israel who have citizenship and some mobility, and yet their citizenship does not allow them the participation in government, as we've seen recently in elections. And then, of course, you have this gradation of citizenship also within Jewish Israeli society. I think are looking at the system of mobility and how it affects political status and how it affects political outcomes, and understanding that the removal of the mobility restrictions is the promotion of democracy, is what will allow political participation, means we need to center on the siege of Gaza as an example for how destructive mobility restrictions are for any type of political solution. And I think changing our view from looking at actors and what their interests are and how do you negotiate with these and that, yes, that's useful and it's helpful, and I learn a lot from it as well. And there's so much work that's been done that I think can help make change. But what needs to change, first of all, is our perspective on mobility and the centrality of it to everyone's operations, and also to the position in front of those that are currently in power in the Israeli government and its different organizations.
If I could just touch on the security issue a bit further. Israelis in particular, but also the international community, often takes it as read that these movement restrictions are based on genuine, concrete security concerns. And you've already discussed that to some degree. And of course, there's a real tension between the positions that are voiced by the Israeli defense establishment, which, you know, we often end up finding are unlikely allies in some ways, because they tend to advocate for easing the humanitarian situation and the closure, versus the rhetoric of cabinet members who tend to support more aggressive military tactics, the tightening of the closure. So how do you see the relationship between security and the closure of Gaza? And do you also get reactions like we do at Gisha and other NGOs that you're calling for the undermining of security? And then how do you address that criticism? Thanks.
Yeah, that was actually my first question. Like, I was really interested. I wanted to understand, like, how does this work? Is this, as a sociologist, you really want to know, how does the mechanism work? Why are things built as they do? And what was shocking to me was actually to see the way, as you said, the people in the civil administrations are the ones saying, you need to ease the restrictions are bad for us. And then you had the way I saw it, and this is about the West Bank, it's less about Gaza. I saw the Shin Bet, the Secret Service, move from a position of recommendation about security into a position of basically calling the shots and being the organization that classified population through a lens of security for its own needs. And what happens is, when there is a lack of leadership, the first thing that leadership refrains to challenge is the issue of security. And in Israel, one of the tactics that you would hear all the time is that, and this is like the heads of the civil administration, this is sometimes people inside of the security apparatus that are questioning policy. And when they would question policy, the answer back to them would be, well, do you want to take responsibility for the next bus that blows up? Which stifles the conversation and doesn't allow any going forward because everyone is so afraid to move. Now, what that does is also means that you cannot question the structure of the social field which is being discussed, right? We can't question it. This is about security, and then everything else is kind of catered to that. And the question, what is security? What promotes the security of Israelis, of Jewish Israelis? No, that question is not asked. It's taken as a given that mobility restrictions, separation, segregation, the wall, military rule, and having your knee on the necks of millions of people is security, which we know historically that is completely untenable and unsustainable. So not only are the practices themselves not questioned, but the apparatus itself. Now, they are deeply questioned in internal conversations. And this is one thing that I think a lot of us have noticed, right? When people leave their jobs in the security apparatus, suddenly they're willing to talk about this. But they're in this vortex, which so any challenge that what Israel is doing is because of security and not because of control, is scary to people because they get called out for, do you want to take responsibility for this? Are you not loyal enough? Are you a traitor? I mean, it's this whole loyalty and suspicion axis that goes on within the internal apparatus. But what you see, and this is something that I'm sure that Gisha know a lot about, sometimes people from the civil administration would ask the people from the kibbutzim surrounding Gaza to make requests to have workers from Gaza so they could release the pressure. So, and I've heard this time and again, and it's kind of shocking, right? You say to yourself, wait a minute, you are the people in power, why aren't you doing it? They feel that they are caged within this structure. So, in a way, I think that one of the things that might free the people inside of the apparatus of the bureaucracy of the occupation to speak their mind and to make the policy recommendations they think might really work and be beneficial would be if, instead of catering and taking for granted that when Israeli officials say security, you're going to just take that as a face value, to challenge that, ask how political it is, ask what this has to do with political structures. This is a tough thing to do. It's obviously very intimidating. Also because many times as lawyers, as human rights workers, as diplomats, you're approaching and you have something in mind that you want to achieve. You just want to get it through. You want to get a family through. You want to get a cancer patient through. You want to have X amount of people working again. There's all these things that, you know, you have humans in front of your eyes and you want to see, and you want to achieve that. But in a way, understanding, and this is something that I think Tawfiq Haddad, he makes a wonderful argument, and he says international organizations are the ones that legitimate the depolitization between the political organizations, you know, between the politics and the security. This is not a technical issue. We have to talk all about it. Do mobility restrictions work? The short answer is no. I'm totally willing to go in and battle that. That's literally what I tried to do in the book. But yeah. Happy
Thank you so
more
much, El. That was very, very interesting. And so now I'm going to move towards Natalie, who I suppose somewhat represents, or at least can provide some insight into the kind of international perspective on this and the international community policy perspective. So I kind of want to start with quite a broad question, which is about the idea of the two-state solution. Of course, analysts have been sounding the death knell of the two-state solution for many years. The threat of formal annexation earlier this year only intensified those warnings. But now that formal annexation is off the table, at least for the time being, it seems that there's a real risk that the international community sinks back into this kind of deadly passivity, this stasis that we've been seeing for a number of years. All the while Israel entrenches the status quo, or potentially even goes beyond the status quo, as we've been seeing recently with the moves towards normalization, the UAE deal, and the cascade of, you know, steps towards normalization we've seen since then. All the while, the chances of peace are growing ever more remote, and the separation of Gaza is being entrenched. So, of course, EU policy is predicated on the idea of a two-state solution. If that's no longer possible, and that, of course, is a question, is it time that the EU actually overhauled its policy position towards the Middle East peace process as a whole? And also, what about its policy towards Gaza now?
Well, thanks, Beth. And I think that the risk is a far more serious risk than one of passivity. I think that the risk is one of re-becoming very active, but in a very different and counterproductive way. Now, I mean, I think you're very right, you know, sort of pre the whole sort of annexation saga, we'd been in this state, this kind of, you know, inertial, passive state of basically seeing on the one hand the entrenchment of occupation that in different ways, both Abir and Yael, I think, described in a very powerful way. But in a sense, particularly over the last decade or so, the whole region was on fire, and therefore attention was distracted elsewhere. And yes, indeed, the occupation is there, and Gaza is there, but, you know, let us keep on talking the talk of the two-state solution, and perhaps at some point that talk is going to sort of, you know, materialize into something more. Then comes the whole sort of threat of annexation, which, for reasons that, you know, we all know, and I won't get into, has now, assuming that it ever really was a threat, has in any case now been sort of, you know, there's been a step back from the brink. Now, I think the risk that the international community, beginning with the European Union, is in now is that of not simply rewinding back to where we were 6 months ago, but it's basically that of saying, hey, this is a real achievement. The fact that there has not been annexation is a real achievement. And in fact, what we have to do is reward Israel for this big achievement. And I think this is where we are now. And I think this is where we ought to sort of focus our minds, because I think this, as I said, I think this is a very real risk. So I think it's worth sort of reflecting a little bit as to where we actually are. So firstly, to what extent was the annexation a threat? I mean, obviously it was in all sorts of legal ways. It was perhaps slightly less in practical ways, for reasons that I think people living in the region can understand far better than I can. But in a sense, it had inbuilt into it I mean, it may sound a little bit obscene what I'm about to say, but just kind of sort of follow through the logic of it, an opportunity. And the opportunity was that of shaking the international community out of that inertia that we've been in. And therefore basically saying, well, the two-state solution has been a wonderful idea, but we really did believe in it, but obviously Israel did not. And this is the sort of tangible proof that it did not. And therefore we had, no matter how much we dislike the situation, we're forced into we're sort of obliged to think about alternatives. At the very least, we're obliged to think, which is already a starting point. And obviously, now that that threat is not there in the same way, there is a tendency to sort of go back to where we were. So in a sense, there is, on the one hand, this question of an opportunity, quote unquote, which has been missed. On the other, there is the question of to what extent has there actually been an achievement? So, I mean, obviously, sort of, opening diplomatic relations between countries can always and necessarily be seen as a good thing. This is what diplomacy is there for. You have diplomacy precisely because there are all sorts of problems to resolve. And this, by the way, should also be something, to make the Gaza parallel here, precisely because there is the perception of a problem in Gaza. This is precisely why, the sort of whole non-recognition policy, for instance, was such a terrible mistake. So, obviously it's not Natalie that will be saying that opening relations between Israel and the UAE or Kosovo or Serbia or what have you is a bad thing. But I think it's worth reflecting to what extent it's actually an achievement. I mean, we're not talking about relations being opened or relations being normalized between countries which were at war. They were not at war, and therefore it is not peace that has been achieved. And so I think it's important to put all this in perspective and again, sort of shake ourselves out of our European comfort zone in simply stopping at the assessment of saying, well, this is a great thing, and actually a bad thing has not happened, and therefore a reward has to ensue. I think then there is a real danger, and beyond the question of what is the reward that we're actually talking about, whatever, you reactivate the EU-Israel Association Council. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which rewards can be given, but I think probably the most serious risk, the extent to which this will be materialized will obviously depend on not so much what happens in Europe, but what happens on the 3rd of November in the United States, is that of, in a sense, the sort of very instinctive diplomatic, if you like, mindset parallel being made between there is the threat, an averted threat of annexation, which opens the way back into diplomacy, translated into a Middle East peace process. Now, there are all sorts of ways why that transition is a problematic one. It becomes all the more problematic if the interpretation of that Middle East peace process is anything has anything to do with a revitalization of the Trump plan, which of course is the real risk of, in a sense, the UAE-Israel normalization, beyond, on the one hand, not necessarily meaning great things because there was not a war between the two countries, but the real risk is that of revitalizing something that was dead in the water, i.e. the Trump plan. Now, obviously, that risk is all the more concrete in the event of a victory of Trump on the 3rd of November. But even in the event that this will not happen, even in the event of a Biden administration, there is an element of risk of appropriating some of the aspects, some of the philosophy embedded into that plan into any attempt at revitalizing a process. And the process and the problem as far as Europeans are concerned is that, as I said, there is a very instinctive sort of knee-jerk assumption that talks are good, that annexation is bad, that the two-state solution in words is good. So that the sort of talking the talk is what is necessary, and having averted this perceived danger, as I said, it's more than simply a danger of, a risk of going back to passivity, but rather actively sort of moving back into a mindset which has obviously in many respects taken us exactly where we have been, where we are now.
And what could a reformulated EU policy actually look like, and how can it bring Gaza into the equation as well?
Well, I mean, here I think that and I think this connects in many respects to the points that both Yael and Abir were making earlier, which is really this question of rights and where one must keep I mean, what is the ball where our eyes must focus on, and there is indeed this sort of tendency to assume that focusing on rights is somewhat something that is indeed important, but it distracts attention from the political, especially when that political is translated into a political process, which is translated into a Middle East peace process, which has the connotations that we know all too well. Rather than actually saying, well, hang on a sec, the constitutional endpoint of all this is obviously important, but it's in many respects actually secondary. What is primary, what has to be the priority, is the rights question. So when it comes to movement, it is to Gaza, it is the movement question. When it comes, there are all sorts of ways in which the rights question, one can give a concrete meaning to the rights question. But in a sense, that requires sort of refocusing attention away from the grand framework, which inevitably gets us bogged down into how many states there are going to be and et cetera, to the basics, which are not only important today and tomorrow, but which ultimately are the stuff through which any sustainable constitutional endpoint is going to be made of. No, I can't hear you.
I'm on mute. No, I'm unmuted. And then the question of how EU policy may have actually inadvertently kind of fostered some of the political drivers of the conflict. So if we think, you mentioned the no contact policy, how may EU policy have inadvertently actually entrenched the separation of Gaza from the West Bank and maybe kind of prolonged this conflict in a sense?
Well, I mean, I think in sort of probably two very obvious ways. I mean, first is the whole sort of non-recognition policy, which by definition entrenches a policy of separation. If you recognize the authorities on one side and you don't recognize the authorities on the other, by definition, you are conducting, you are entrenching, in fact, you're even driving a policy of separation. And then secondly, and connected to this, is the link between the sort of the political and the rights question and the if you like, the conflict question with the democracy question. And in a sense, EU policy towards Gaza has in a sense been reinforcing the de-democratization trends both in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. Both of which obviously being drivers, although not primary drivers, which of course has everything to do with Israel's occupation, but certainly secondary drivers to the entrenchment of the conflict, I would say.
Thank you, Natalie.